Jack Kirby developed this very recognizable style, probably most noticeably in those big chunky hands and fingers and faces that often looked carved out of a rock. It became increasingly stylized as his career progressed. The use of Kirby dots and speed lines linked to this, but there was a process in getting to this look. One born out of necessity for speed, sure, but in that speed came a signature look that still stands up as an excellent and clear approach to comic book storytelling. So in this episode, I want to look at Kirby's style and see how it answers the question of what we mean when we talk about an artist's style in comics. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. So, to get a good understanding of how this style changed, we've got to look at his early work. Strips like The Black Buccaneer had a style that moved a little more towards realism. A clear light source and shading, and a contrast to his style by the time we reached the Eternals in the 70s. Even on more superheroic works, Kirby still tended towards that kind of realism, and you can see it in early Captain America. It's very much the antithesis of character work that would define Kirby's later art. Lanky and lean as opposed to thick and stocky. It's actually not until you get into Kirby's superhero publisher work much later on, around Marvel and DC, that you see that style start to really develop. And a big part of that seems to have been speed. The difference between an earlier issue of Captain America and when Kirby returned to the title in issue 193 really shows that difference. Chunkier, thicker ink lines, a much more stylized look. Though actually the building blocks of the paneling and composition approaches is the same. And this raises that question, the question that I want this episode to kind of answer, which is what do we mean when we talk about an artist's style? Because here is a comic book artist whose look seems to change quite dramatically over a few decades. However, a lot of the foundational points of the style are actually the same. And the first of those is the gridded approach. As a general rule, for his later work, I want to look at what Kirby did with the Eternals, which was built heavily on a grid, most frequently the 6-panel grid. This is the same as Captain America 2, both when Kirby began with the series and when he returned to the comic later on. And you can see the same hallmarks in the paneling approach. And at this point in Strip Panel Naked, we've heavily discussed the grid, but it's worth saying that for Kirby, it appeared to be a solution for pacing and paneling that was really workable. The grid could expand, as it often did on one tier, allowing a slightly more dynamic image, and Kirby could always switch it up to a 4-panel grid if desired, but ultimately it's the 6 grid that seems to give you enough density, still allows panels to work as pairs on a tier, and fits, interestingly, the square approach that is reminiscent of the kinds of strips that Kirby initially worked on and was probably most familiar with. And the other thing is compositional elements, because Kirby seemed to stick to a pretty simple rule, which was to try and have a clear foreground and a clear background element. One was a focal point of the panel, and one was used as a way of kind of filling in some space and adding a bit more dynamism. And that is a key point that we will come back to with some other techniques like the Kirby dots and speed lines too. But if you look at this panel for example, Kirby has one character looking towards the reader placed in the background, and the back of 2 heads just make up the foreground. So the back of heads means obviously yes, it's a quicker draw, but it still allows dialogue from those characters. And the background character is rendered in a heavy brush style across the chest, which minimizes rendering on him too. Elsewhere on the page, something similar happens where you have 2 characters in the background while just the leg of the same character stands in the foreground. And it is dynamic staging, it's really dynamic staging, but it also means it's a lot quicker for Kirby to draw this than it is to draw like an entire extra body. Another panel on this page repeats the same format too, the first panel having a character in the background with a planet sat in the foreground. It immediately makes that panel more dynamic because it has depth. And it also makes Kirby's decisions on the page easier, because he's working this into a standard system. The panels almost start to design themselves when you pull from those handful of approaches and you know what will work and what won't. And this is where the Kirby dots and the speed lines also come in, because they added a way for Kirby to give extra dimension to a panel that may not necessarily have had another character or anything else in there. Kirby dots basically added instant texture. If you look at that same panel with the planets, it has the appearance of a very deep background. But what that is built from is really just a series of nondescript circles and Kirby dot patterns. Similarly, on another page, speed lines are used in 2 panel backgrounds just to add some texture and dynamism to otherwise empty backgrounds. While on another 2 panels on the same page, Kirby dots are used in the exact same way, just to fill in a background that has no other rendering. Therefore, Kirby is able to very quickly and easily add depth to an otherwise blank space. Because it's in that shorthand where you see what an artist deems important for their own work. And with Kirby, that was really clear. If his interest seemed less about backgrounds or dynamic panel layouts or realistic rendering of figures, then what's left? It's the theatrical heightened drama of a character. Everything is big and bold, the chunky nature of the figures aids the stories he was telling, these large space soap operas. Everyone is constantly in a dynamic pose of action, right? Screaming or pointing or flinging themselves forward or locked upright with their arms crossed, right? And the line is key too. Kirby's thick brush creating a solid silhouette and outline, and check out last time's episode for more on that, which meant he had very little rendering to do within the figures. And often you'll find it was nothing more than just defining some muscles or some kind of textures on cloth. Otherwise, his figures were built on a similar foundation, a strong oblong head with defined cheekbones in every case, and stocky figures with thick calves and fingers that could contort for drama. So this is the question of style, right? This is the question that this episode is trying to answer. What is an artist's style? The easiest way to define this is to take what an artist puts forward. So what are they placing in many of their pages, many of their comics? How are they composing them in similar ways? What are they leaving out, right? You could say that style is as simple for Kirby as not putting in backgrounds, but that leaves out the understanding of why that happens. So in Kirby's example, dropping backgrounds out means speed, but they're also replaced by texture, which aids in storytelling and is able to add drama. And this is the reason why Kirby's storytelling was and is so strong. All of his touches to style, his backgrounds, the Kirby dots, the figure works, all of that, it's doing the same thing. Essentially, he's adding the same theory to different elements of the practice. All those elements there are working to create heightened theatrical drama that is clear and concise on the page, minimizing the elements down to their key focal points. His style is really just a way to learn what he considered important in visual storytelling. Make everything theatrically big in the figures, and look, the reader's going to go with you. I'm aware that much of this kind of sounds like I'm saying maybe Kirby was lazy and that he didn't want to draw certain elements, but that's really a misunderstanding of what his style was. Much of this absolutely was born out of a necessity to draw comic book pages fast. But he did this in the smartest way possible, which is to understand what was important and what was relevant to the kinds of stories he wanted to tell. And what he effectively did was manage to turn shorthand into his style. Or rather, I think this is probably the more accurate way of saying that, he proved that so often what style actually is an artist's shorthand. Thanks for watching. If you're a fan of Strip Pile Naked, you can support the Patreon page, where for your pledge you'll get access to years worth of exclusive content and annotations. You can find me on Twitter at HassanOE, and you can get my Eisner Award-winning magazine at panelxpanel.com. And finally, hit subscribe and that notification bell to keep up to date with all the latest episodes, and we'll see you next time.